Hey, everybody. Before we get into this episode, I just wanted to make a quick PSA, if you will. Now, in this episode, Rizwan and I have an amazing conversation. He was one of the first guests that was in studio. And I am still obviously working out some kinks. As you'll see in the episode, I needed to have him correct his mic positioning. And unlike Joe Rogan, who will tell you right up, move up on the microphone, I didn't do it. And we weren't wearing headphones. Another rookie mistake. This is an audio podcast. Most of my audience is on audio platforms. I definitely need to work on that. It's something that it's obviously imperative to get right and to be better. So just know that I am listening. We are working on it. I am very sorry for any inconvenience. The episode is amazing. I highly recommend that you watch this episode on YouTube, as it is filmed in the new studio. And it's amazingly shot, amazingly edited by our new editor, Kari Lindsay. Also, I noticed by the analytics that most people that are watching are not following the show. If you can do me a favor right now and just smash that like button like it owes you money, share this with your friends, your family, your enemies, the grays. I don't care. We don't discriminate here at TDP. And we really appreciate anyone who can support the channel monetarily. You'll get access to early and ad-free versions of the show, no matter what classification you come in on. It's pay what you think the show is worth to you. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Rizwan Virk. Start. So I mean, again, I just want to say thank you. To start, I just want to say thank you for being here, for doing this, because for me, it's like I said, it's a really full circle moment. You're the first guest. I had a couple other people in here, but they're locals, Gene and Nat Sticko. So I just want to say again, thank you, Riz, for being. Is Riz okay?
Yeah.
All right. All right. Let's get into it. All right, welcome back to Total Disclosure. My name is Ty Roberts, and today we're diving headfirst into a mind-bending theory that challenges the very nature of the world around us, or what socially we describe as reality, the simulation hypothesis. Our guest is someone uniquely qualified to help us navigate this digital rabbit hole. I was very happy to meet him at a recent conference, Contact in the Desert, and now we're sitting here in the studio. Rizwan Virk is a graduate of MIT and a successful tech entrepreneur, investor, and best-selling author. His books, including coming out next week or this week, whenever we're watching, a brand new second edition of the simulation hypothesis and the simulated multiverse, have and will capture the imagination of millions by blending quantum physics, computer science, philosophy, and ancient wisdom. He's founded multiple tech companies, helped launch startups through Play Labs via MIT, and even dipped his toes in Hollywood as a film producer. I'm so sorry about that. Making him a rare bridge between science, storytelling, and speculative thought. Could our reality be nothing more than a sophisticated simulation? Could UFOs, the paranormal, synchronicities, and even disclosure all be features or bugs in the program? And more importantly, who or what is running it? Riz, thank you for being here. Let's log in. Let's log into the simulation to find out. Riz, thank you for being here on Total Disclosure. I'm going to start because I know I kind of want to go head first in. What first led you to explore the simulation hypothesis in the depths that you've done, and how did your background at MIT influence your approach on this?
Sure. Well, my background is as a computer scientist,
Mm-hmm.
an engineer, and then as a tech entrepreneur. And not surprisingly, those are the disciplines or paths that really led me into this rabbit hole that we now refer to as simulation theory. And so what happened was when I sold my last startup back in like 2016 or so, I was visiting another game company in San Francisco, actually across San Francisco Bay in Marin County, and they had developed a virtual reality ping pong game. And so I had this VR headset on, and they said, "You got to try this. You got to try this." I was like, "Okay, let's try it." Put it on, and it was a room about this size, and it was a big, bulky headset. There were wires coming from the ceiling. I mean, VR headsets have improved quite a bit since
Right.
I think it was the HTC Vive. And I started playing this ping pong table tennis game. And what happened was during this game, the graphics weren't that great. And so I was in the video game industry
Right.
for quite a few years. And of course, I'm familiar with the evolution of video games all, throughout my lifetime. When I was a kid, I played the Atari.
Like the original Pong, right? Those originals.
Original, well, close to the original because it was the original home version.
Right.
And then at arcades, we had Space Invaders, which, were pretty much the games that most people have heard of as kicking off the industry. The industry actually kicked off with Pong in like the early 1970s. So that was even before.
Wow.
I think it was 72 or 74 when they released the physical arcade.
Right.
Pong. Yeah.
Wow. It's and you can kind of see the evolution to like Space Invaders, like how the leap went. Like it's kind of similar and like it's very basic in its nature. But it's just repetitive. It's fun. It's just a side note. But yeah, that's so that's how. So how did that derive into you thinking about this on a deeper level?
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Pong because the game keeps coming up when you're talking about this subject. But I saw the 8-bit games from Atari and Nintendo back in the 80s, and then you saw the 16-bit games, and there's a slide that I show sometimes, like a Contact in the Desert and elsewhere, that shows the evolution of racing games. And so if I go back to one of the original games, I think it was called Pole Position, and I used to watch this game on my Atari, and you'd be going around the racetrack, and there would be these characters in the bleachers. I mean, they were really basic 2D graphics. It was like
blurry, yeah.
As a kid, I would start to wonder, okay, what happens to these characters when I'm not around? Or there would be a scene of Mount Fuji in the distance, and I'd wonder, okay, what's beyond the racetrack? Is there really a virtual world out there?
Right.
So video games and science fiction kind of played a role, but then you see the 16-bit racing games, and they look better. Then you see the 32-bit and 64-bit games, and you see that they're so realistic now that they look like they're real cities in there. And so going back to the VR ping pong experience, I was playing table tennis in virtual reality, and for a moment, my mind or my body forgot that I was in a VR headset, and I thought I was playing a real game of table tennis. So much so that I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and I tried to lean against the table, but of course there was no table. So the fell to the floor, and I almost fell over, so I had to do a double take. And so I said to myself, okay, based on that, really bad graphics, really bulky headset with wires, there was no mistaking that I was not playing a real game. But the responsiveness, the physics engine was so good that it fooled my brain and my body just for an instant into thinking it was real. So I began to wonder, how long would it take us to build something like the Matrix that was so immersive and so realistic that you would basically forget there's a world outside.
Right.
And at the time I was in Silicon Valley and I was building video games. So it became a technology discussion initially. And I laid out these 10 stages of technology to get to what I call the simulation point.
Right.
And I define the simulation point as a theoretical point where we can build virtual realities that are indistinguishable from physical realities with AI characters that are indistinguishable from characters controlled by humans,
right,
or avatars or biological beings as well. And so that's how I started going down the rabbit hole. But of course, after I looked into that, and I had other VR experiences as well we can talk about, but that was the one that always stuck in my memory. But then I started to look at quantum physics, and I realized there were so many strange things going on with quantum physics that it just wouldn't make sense for us to be in a physical world. Why would you do these things? On the other hand, if we were in a virtual world, these things which are pretty much, so confusing that it
Right.
just can't be understood. I mean, Richard Feynman
Yup.
said,
Right.
nobody understands quantum mechanics, right?
On the other hand, I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics.
And then I started looking at the spiritual traditions and the religious scriptures and what the mystics of these traditions have been telling us. And the mystics have basically been telling us that the world is some kind of a hoax, and they were able to peek outside the simulation and come back
Bingo.
in. And at least that's a terminology I like to use.
Bingo.
So given the combination of these three things, the technology, the science, the religion, the spiritual side of religions, if you will, and philosophy, it turned out all of these were pointing to something very interesting. And I had explored different aspects of consciousness as well. I was kind of living a double life, where during the day I was running my startup, dealing with engineering things, dealing with VCs and finance, but in the evenings and the weekends, I would fly off to, the Monroe Institute to try to do an out-of-body experience, or I would do shamanic.
Really?
So I had been living this double life for a while,
Oh.
but it was interesting for me because it pulled together the simulation hypothesis. And that's why I wrote this book, is that it pulled together all the threads of my life. And that's how I got into all of this. Yeah.
Wow. I remember, I've only done it once. I put on a VR headset. It was the PlayStation one, like one of the first ones.
Yeah,
so it wasn't
PSVR,
like tied to the, it wasn't like that. But you're right. After about an hour, it fooled me. Like it fooled my senses and my brain, or the way you explained it. It tricked my consciousness into thinking that it was base reality. And I start, like you said, you start thinking things are there, because I was ducking. It was one of those shooter games where you run around and it was like stick figures. So the graphics, again, are terrible. So I can relate to that experience. And again, these are where these questions start coming from.
Have you tried some of the latest VR, AR headsets?
No.
If you try the Apple Vision Pro, now it wasn't successful as a commercial product. That's
right.
Because it was like $3,000, $4,000.
Just not feasible.
And it wasn't that comfortable, but the graphics level is amazing, to the point where I would look up and I would see my hands. But turns out they were reproducing my hands. So they were able to take the room and digitally add things into the room that looked very real, even though they're not really there. So that's called
augmented reality. Right. Right.
And it's like you have a little control where you can set the transparency so that it actually can reproduce the room, or it can just produce like a movie theater that you're not actually in, that looks like
while you're on the moon.
Castle. What's that?
I saw one that like someone was watching a movie on the moon.
Yes.
Like that they put themselves on the moon and then, put the movie up. I'm like, what the? So then this is all leading me to, well, I guess you kind of explained what it is, but in simple terms, what the simulation hypothesis is, and how it's different from just science fiction concepts like the Matrix from the movie, because there's a difference.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say that the simulation hypothesis has its origins in philosophy and in science fiction, right? And I think in the West, the best expressions of this idea do come from science fiction. So it becomes the easiest way to explain the concept. But if I were to define it, I would say it's basically the idea that what we see around us, this table, anything on the table, is not really a physical reality, but in fact is a virtual reality. So it's been generated based on information. And so, there's a couple of assumptions that go behind that,
right? Which
is that the universe is based on information. And the second one is that information is rendered for us in a way
real time
to make it look real.
Right.
Right. So we think and then the implications of that are that this is some kind of a hoax, that all of this. Now, there's different flavors of the simulation hypothesis, which we can go into a little bit later, which I have NPC versus RPG version. But that's the basic idea. Now, you can go back to science fiction writers like Philip K. Dick. He gave a speech in Metz, France in 1977.
That's right.
So think about that. 1977. I mean, this is before, the IBM PC, right? I think the Apple I or Apple II maybe was just coming out.
Right.
And he gave a speech, and people can see it on YouTube, where he said, "We are living in a computer programmed reality. And the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality.
We are living in a computer programmed reality.
So that could explain déjà vu or the Mandela effect.
Yeah, so his next line is, we would have a sense of déjà vu. we would think that we were repeating the same experiences, or we were saying the same things again and again. And so he took that to be a clue that there was something weird about reality, and that reality was being run like a computer program, and it was being run multiple times. But so that was, Philip K. Dick was a science fiction writer. Some people might say, okay, he took too many drugs. Back then, if you watch that video, people are in the audience, including his friend, one of his friends, Joan Simpson, I think was her name. She was sitting there, and they're just like, "What are you talking about?
Right.
You totally lost it."
Right.
But it turns out that in the same year as The Matrix, there was another blockbuster or big budget movie called The 13th Floor.
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and so that turns out was based on a science fiction novel. Well, it was based on a TV show, a German TV show, but that was based on a science fiction novel from the 1960s by a guy named Daniel Galouye, which was called Simulacron 3. So you can see this concept bubbling up in science fiction for a long time. Of course, The Matrix is the best known representation of it. And the Wachowskis, who made The Matrix, said they were inspired by Philip K. Dick.
Right.
As an aside, I interviewed Philip K. Dick's wife when I was writing the first version of this book, and Tessa, she's still around. You can interview her, actually. She's pretty old now, I guess. I don't know her exactly.
Is she around the area?
No, she's not. She's not here. She's in California.
Okay. Well, so yeah.
Is where she lived, somewhere around there. Right?
I'd love to talk to her. Yeah, I would.
But anyway, I asked her, so what would Philip think about The Matrix? And she said, well, his first thought would be that he would love it. The ideas are ideas he's been playing with. But his second thought would be to call his agent and say, can I sue these guys for stealing my ideas?
IP theft. I love it.
But so the idea has been around in science fiction for a while, but it's really as computer technology and video games and AI technology has
evolved
popular and better at representing things, that this idea has caught on, and that's mostly thanks to a guy named Nick Bostrom, who's a philosopher at Oxford.
Okay.
And he wrote a paper in 2003, so we're talking just a couple of years after The Matrix
comes out. 99, right?
Yeah, 99. It was March 31st, 1999. And a couple of years later, Nick Bostrom released his paper that was titled, Are You Living in a Computer Simulation? And he came at it from a philosophical perspective, but also from the perspective of AI. And his basic argument, which he called the simulation argument, was if somebody can build AI characters that have all of the memories that we have and all of the processing powers that we have,
right,
that it wouldn't take that much computing power. Therefore, that much, meaning in cosmic terms.
Yeah, not completely out of the realm of possibility. Like
give it 1,000 years. I mean, he was saying that if there was a technological civilization, I mean, he didn't give a time frame, but that was able to get to this stage, he estimated the number of operations that we have in our brains, the amount of memories we have stored, and he said even a computer the size of the moon would be able to represent all of human history and every single interaction and memory that has ever gone on, and that's using today's estimates and technology. But basically, he said if a civilization ever gets to that point, then they're going to want to create simulations of the past, and he called those ancestor simulations. And so, but his point, what he called the simulation argument, was that if any civilization ever gets there, he said there's a couple of possibilities. One is they can't do it; they never get there. Maybe they blow themselves up
long before then. Yeah.
The second is they get there, but they decide not to make any simulations. Okay, which I think is a little unlikely. So let's just group those two together.
Okay.
There's no simulation. There's no such civilization that ever makes such simulations.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third possibility, he said, was that we are most definitely in a simulation. And why? He said because if they can create one simulation, they can create another one just by adding more server power. And inside each of these simulations, there could be 1 billion simulated beings, or how many do we have on Earth? 7 billion.
7 billion,
Or
right,
a
right,
trillion, right? So at that point, we're just talking more computing power.
right.
So his argument was a statistical one. And that's where the terminology, the simulation hypothesis, came from, which is that are you more likely to be in a simulated world, or are you more likely to be in a physical world? I mean, he actually said, are you more likely to be a simulated mind versus being a biological mind?
Right.
But then Elon Musk came around a few years later
And said that chances we are in base reality are what, 0?
1 in billions.
1 in billions, yes.
Which means the chances that we're not in base reality, i.e. that we're in a simulation, would be billions to 1. And that he said that in 2016, which was the same year that I was playing, this ping pong game. Starting to think about it. And so that was the argument that caught on, and this terminology became popular. That said, there's an alternative version of that, which is the Matrix version, where in the Matrix, you actually had Neo and Morpheus and Trinity. They existed outside the video game or outside simulation. And then they had characters or avatars inside. And so those are the two different flavors that I was talking about, which is more AI NPCs or actual players of the game who exist outside of the simulation. And that's an interesting access and a rabbit hole to go down in and of itself, because it raises all kinds of issues around free will, religion, spirituality.
Right. The big ones. Yeah. And that's kind of, where I want to build on that, because honestly, if tomorrow, I mean, we talk about UFO disclosure a lot, but if tomorrow we confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that we are in fact in a simulation, that reality as we experience it is in fact simulated, what would it really change? I mean, the table would still be a table, the microphone would still be a microphone. It's more or less the more philosophical implications that I see being a cause for concern, people's motivations, their will to live, and what keeps society in check, if you will. So, I mean, what does it really change if we confirm it?
Well, that's an interesting question.
The bills are still due tomorrow.
Yeah, so we're still in the simulation, right? So
right.
We have to treat it as if it's real while we're here. But at the same time, just because it may not be the ultimate reality doesn't mean the experiences that we're having aren't real.
And that's what I meant. And this is what I mean, because I feel like people are, and sorry about the tangent here, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I feel like people look at this the wrong way, because they say, if it's a simulation, then we must not mean anything.
And nothing matters.
And nothing matters, right. And I would say that it's the exact opposite. I think that we matter even more. And then it kind of confirms that if it's a simulation, there is a simulator, aka God, whatever you want to call it. And there exists outside of the simulation. So it would confirm a lot of the religious philosophy, if you will. So I'm just not, I feel like people are looking at it the wrong way.
Yeah, I think you're correct in that. And I think that's why I tend to be one of the few people talking about simulation theory who focuses on this idea of the NPC versus RPG flavors of simulation theory. And I say it's more of an axis, if you will, because it's a continuum. You can start off with a computer simulation that has 100% AI, and that's, we're watching it run, and it's running the whole civilization. Like, we might want to simulate the spread of a virus, or economic stock market.
See how it plays out, right?
See how it plays out. At the other end, we're all players of the game, and we all have characters, and we all have quests and achievements, and we're all having certain experiences together. Now, in a video game like, say, World of Warcraft, you have both. You have both NPCs and PCs, or player characters, or avatars.
Right.
The term avatar itself comes from Sanskrit, and not many people know where it came from. Because
really?
What it originally meant was you had a divine entity that squeezes itself into a physical body. So it was an incarnation of a divine entity. And so what happened was that the guys who were building one of the first MMORPGs, although it wasn't a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, it was just a multiplayer online role-playing game. It was using Commodore 64s back in the 80s with the modems and the dial-up.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
And it was at Lucasfilm, which is George Lucas.
Yep.
Special effects company after he had released Star Wars. And so they built a game called Habitat, and they had these little 2D characters on the screen, and you would maybe have like 5 or 10 people in a room, but they were looking for a term to describe their character. And he said it felt like I was taking myself, a physical body, squeezing into the telephone lines, the Commodore 64, telephone lines,
right,
into this tiny little character on the screen. And so they chose the term avatar. So even that hints at the spiritual elements of this idea. And so that's why I think if you think of it more as a continuum, some people say, well, if I'm in a simulation, then nothing matters. And that's kind of equivalent to kind of a nihilistic, philosophy. Like if the number of players is 0, there's also solipsism and, nothing matters but me, which would mean n equals 1.
Right.
Then on the other end, you're up to n equals 100% our source players. And so I think, for example, if you and I are interacting with each other in a video game, does that mean we're not really interacting? We happen to be in the same studio right now, but the other day I was doing a Zoom call with somebody about this, and I said, are we actually having a conversation? Well, technically, no. I was talking to my computer,
and
the bits were sent to his computer, and his computer was, replaying my words, and then he was talking to his computer. And yet we had a real conversation. So if you were in a video game and you learned a language, do you still know that language that you learned from interacting with people in the game outside? You absolutely do.
Right.
So in that sense,
wow,
I think, these can be thought of as very real experiences that really do matter. So I think that's a different perspective on this idea. But it can also help us when we're dealing with challenges in life. So, for example, we all have physical challenges sometimes, illnesses, we have financial challenges,
Absolutely.
relationship challenges, right? You name it. Life is a series of challenges. And if we view life as a series of challenges or quests, I think it can bring a different perspective to our lives. And it makes it a little bit easier to deal with. Instead of saying, oh yeah, life sucks and that's it, and life is suffering, you say, okay, well, maybe there's a reason I'm going through this and I can learn something from this experience. And it's one challenge that perhaps my player, that part of me which exists outside the simulation, is watching this on a screen right now. Kind of, I call it the writer's room. That's the writer's room. That's a good one. Yeah. You're sitting there watching your Sims, your avatars play out, and you're like, okay, what challenge do we want to throw at this guy or at this gal next, right? What crazy, drop some COVID on them. Exactly. Yeah. You've got doing it at the level of the entire civilization. Right. Then individually, what if we were each doing this individually about our own? We're actually signing up for certain quests and certain challenging situations, because when you think about it, who are the actors that win the Academy Awards? They're the ones that play the roles that go through the most difficulty, the most challenges, right? And doesn't mean that these challenges, there's not real suffering. I mean, while you're there, you're absolutely suffering. Just like, a guy in a video game can't walk through the wall. It's real from the perspective of the video game character. Right. But we can have, I think, a different perspective outside of the simulation. So that's why I think it can matter, but in a positive way, not just a negative way.
Okay, so with that being said, then, and I like how you call them quests. It just because it makes everything more like magical. Like go into the gas station is a quest. I'm gonna start using that. If consciousness is non-local, as some quantum theorists and mystics suggest, is it possible that our soul, like you had said, could exist outside the simulation and just interfaces with this avatar, like you had said? It kind of feels like you already answered that, actually.
Well, yeah, it did, but I think that's an important distinction in that this idea of the soul could be the player and the body is the avatar,
right?
Character. And I think that is a good way to look at it. I mean, part of the reason why in this book, in Simulation Hypothesis, I have a whole section dedicated to the world's spiritual traditions. And, some people in the science community are like, why did he do that? This is a scientific idea, or this is a technological idea. Why is he talking about religion? Why is he talking about unexplained phenomenon? And my point is that if you look at all of the world's scriptures, they will use metaphors to try to describe what they saw.
What they saw, right?
And the mystics of these religions that started these religions, or even just the saints along the way, as I said earlier, I think they have this experience where they peeked outside the simulation. Now, that could be through what's often called a theophany, where something comes from outside the physical world, like an angel or some entity comes in and makes them confront it. In the story of Islam, for example, you have the Prophet Muhammad fasting in the mountains in a cave.
Right.
And suddenly the angel Gabriel shows up and grabs him by the head and says, repeat, right? You can't ignore when something like that happens.
No.
Or through means of self-awareness, yogic type means, shamanic type means, somebody is able to raise their awareness outside of their physical body and say, okay, there is more. Now they have to explain that to the people from 2,000 years ago, right? Or 5,000 years ago.
Very limited language, right?
Very limited language. So they came back and they tried to use metaphors. That's why I say almost everything in the scriptures should be taken metaphorically, but that doesn't mean it's not real. It just means that they didn't have the right terminology or cultural context to tell what was going on.
Right.
And this goes back to Plato's cave. So if you know the allegory of the cave.
Absolutely.
So most people know the basic allegory of the cave, which is that you're in a cave and just like there's shadows against the wall, there's a fire by the opening of the cave or a light, and all the people inside the cave see are these shadows on the wall because they happen to be chained to the other side. One guy gets out, breaks his chains, and goes outside. Now, many people have heard the allegory, but they haven't read the whole thing. And when you read it, the first thing that happens when he goes outside is he's blinded. Why? There's too much light. He's not used to the sun.
Sun, right.
Yeah. So that's an interesting aspect when people talk about near-death experiences or they talk about these religious experiences. They always see the light. But the second part of what happens, or what happens near the end, is this guy that Plato calls the philosopher. Let's call him the mystic.
Yes.
Comes back into the cave and he tries to explain to the people what he saw, and they're like, no, that's not real. Nobody's buying it, right?
Can't be real.
And I think that is an experience that often happens, when somebody has this kind of peeking outside of the simulation. And so if you look at the metaphors, one of the metaphors that's used almost verbatim in different scriptures, like in the Bhagavad Gita,
yes,
Hindu traditions, they say that, incarnating and reincarnating is like putting on and taking off a set of clothes or garments. Okay, so it turns out Rumi, who is a Islamic Sufi mystic, uses the exact same metaphor. He says the soul clothes itself in the body, just like the body clothes itself in garments or clothing. And so they were trying to explain what it would mean to enter into a body, but they didn't have the right terminology for it.
Right.
And so I was actually asked to speak at an Islamic jurisprudence conference at a university in the UK. And they had like legal scholars from like Cairo and Germany and
so
London, like serious scholars.
Serious thinkers, yeah.
And sometimes, people who study religion aren't necessarily religious. Sometimes they are, but they know about the background. And they even had an Ayatollah from Iran,
right?
Which was an interesting experience. It's not like the guy we see in the
propaganda.
They're
yeah,
just a bunch of priests who are called Ayatollahs. But anyway, for me, it was interesting. I was like, why are you inviting me to this? I don't know anything about Islamic jurisprudence. They're like, well, your ideas are on simulation theory are quite interesting. And that kind of led me to go down this rabbit hole even deeper of looking at different scriptures. And they were debating, just like we do here in the US, when can you do abortion? When does the soul enter the fetus? Is it a conception?
I think that's an impossible question to answer.
120 days, yeah. And it's a very difficult question to answer. And I said, well, I have a different perspective to give you on that, which is, think of when the soul enters the body is like putting on a VR headset, or it's when you forget about who you were before. So it's that process of attaching, or a brain-computer interface, like in the Matrix.
Right.
And it's not that I was trying to answer the questions per se. I was trying to give them a different way to think about it. That's the point at which you go through what's called the veil of forgetfulness.
Right.
You forget, and then you become incarnated here. But again, these are all just metaphors. And so they didn't have the metaphors of technology or modern technology.
Right. They didn't have the context or lens of technology, and therefore limiting the way that they could speak about these things.
Right.
So flying craft become fire-breathing dragons.
Right, and angels.
And angels,
what are
right.
angels
By
really?
definition, are non-human intelligence.
Right, they're NHI, but some of these angels and gods, if you look at sort of the traditions, like the Hindu traditions, and many of the angels are actually more like functions than actual people. So, for example, I mean, there's like the archangels who may have a personality, but
Right.
in certain traditions, like angels don't have free will. They have to pretty much
Right.
do what God
They're on a
tells them,
mission. Yeah.
which means
Quest.
what are they? Are they more like NPCs? Because think of the recording angel. So there's something called a recording angel, and it exists in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And in Christianity, in the book, I have a picture from like Washington, D.C. of an angel writing down things. It's a recording angel. He's writing down in the book of life. He's writing down the actual like people that get into heaven, right, for St. Peter. But beyond that, there's actually recording of the deeds that you did. And so they're making a judgment on who gets into heaven based on these deeds. So we're going down the religious rabbit hole here a little bit, right?
Right,
So
right.
it turns out in Islam, they're much more specific about this. They say there's 2 recording angels. They have names. They're called the Kiram and Kitabin. And one writes down all your good deeds, and one writes down all your bad deeds. And then when you die, you have to read your book. And that's what, your own self will be the judge, and that's what decides what happens next, whether you get into heaven or not. So I tell people, look, this is a metaphor. These angels doesn't mean that we have, 2 angels each of us, and there's 14 billion angels who are like real people sitting around and have nothing better to do but with a feather pen to write down, Riz, Tyler Studios.
Yeah.
Right? That's a metaphor. They're trying to describe a function, and they end up describing it using terminology that people would understand. Like you mentioned the UFO case. In this case, many of the angels and even the minor gods in like, say, for example, in Hinduism, there's Chitragupta. And who is Chitragupta? He is the accountant, the record keeper. And what does he do? He sits next to Yama, the god of death. Okay, and why? So that Yama doesn't make a mistake about whether you go into a heavenly realm or a hellish realm next. And so he's,
Right.
Chitragupta is recording everything. They call him the accountant. Now, that's a metaphor. There's not one guy sitting there with one book. So what is it a metaphor of? I would say it's a metaphor of a technological process. And if you talk to people who had
near-death experiences,
right?
This is almost
The life review
I was gonna say.
has been described by people as a holographic, panoramic replay of every single event in their life, but from the point of view of the other person.
And that's the craziest thing to me, because if that's if that's what happens, imagine that trick. You get to the afterlife, right? Hitler gets to the afterlife, and now he's experiencing everything, every horrible deed done in his name from the other perspectives.
Right.
So all you're really doing is hurting yourself.
Right, exactly. And you get to experience not just what you did to this person, but then the ripple effects.
And
Like, how does that? So, for example, I mention a guy often named Daniel Brinkley because he wrote a book called Saved by the Light. He was struck by lightning back in the 70s, and it was a best-selling book in the 90s. Is what it was written.
Okay.
And
That wasn't hit. The guy who got hit twice, right?
he did get.
That was him.
He had several near-death experiences.
Okay.
I don't know if he got hit by lightning twice, but he definitely ended up with multiple NDEs
Ooh.
over time.
I'm gonna look
And
into that. What's his name?
His name is Daniel Brinkley. Interesting guy. If you want to have him on your show sometime.
Yeah.
But he used to be in the military, and he told me, that he would shoot people, and he had to experience what it was like to be shot by him.
Oh my
But more
God.
than that, there's what's called the ripple effect, which is once that person has died, you have to see what happened to like that guy's wife,
kids. Yeah.
So now, since you weren't there, how would you know what's happening? And so this is another one of those. This was sparked by another one of those virtual reality experiences I talked about back then. Back in 2016, 2017, I was involved with a startup that had a VR experience where you could replay a game that was not in VR. So you could take a game like League of Legends or Counter-Strike Global Offensive. And by the way, you can watch replays of video game sessions on YouTube. It's like the most popular YouTube content.
It's crazy to me.
People just sit there and just
Watch
replay
other people play video games. It's
But
crazy.
Here you can replay it from any XYZ coordinate. So we could literally put on a headset and I could see what it was like to have shot myself if I was in a first-person shooter. Now, we can't tell you how the person felt. We can't, our video games don't do that.
Not yet.
Not yet. But when I began to think about the life review, I said, okay, as a computer scientist, as an engineer, how would this work? It has to be recorded somewhere. Somewhere in the cloud, in a database. And then it has to be replayed for you in a way that you can replay what's going on. And so for me, it was a realization that the Scroll of Deeds, the Book of Life, Chitragupta the Accountant, and there's a Buddhist version too, where they have almost a similar type of thing.
And Egyptian.
And Egyptian probably
right?
as well. I don't know the specifics on the Egyptian.
The weigh your soul on
the
the feather, and is it
Osiris?
Yeah, they weigh your soul, and if but it's very similar. It's what it was reminding me of the whole time.
Yeah, and that's a metaphor, right? They don't mean you literally are going to step on a scale.
Right,
what
right.
What meant is we're going to look at the sum of what you have done and replay it in some capacity. So the life review is a new version, and a virtual reality replay is our latest way to describe it, of things that mystics have been telling us since the beginning of time that happens after we die. So this gets, the reason I went down this rabbit hole was you had asked me about the soul and the body.
Well, that kind of...
It's a perfect metaphor, and one even that a lot of religious people, haven't fully understood, that what they're being told are metaphors, that there must be a mechanism for it.
Right.
And that mechanism could be something like a virtual reality or a video game.
So I likened it to, how they ask, if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a noise? Well, it feels like to me what you're arguing is that the tree doesn't even exist unless there's a conscious observer.
Well, yeah. So this is where, my research into quantum physics really got me thinking about the nature of physical reality. And there's a couple of big areas there. One is the observer effect. Second is this idea of information. So
right.
What you're talking about is the observer effect in quantum mechanics, which says that things exist in superposition.
Like the double slit experiment.
Double slit experiment.
Right.
Where, is it going to go through this slit or is it going to go through this slit?
Right.
And turns out you don't know
until you watch. Yeah. Until you measure it. Yes.
Until you measure it, or until somebody records it, or you read that recording, or you actually look at it. And so the point is, they say that what happens is that the electron or the photon or the atom, even, because they've gotten to the point where they say, even certain atoms can be in superposition, so they're getting bigger and bigger.
Right.
They're in a state of superposition, which means they're going through both slits until the observation happens or the measurement happens.
Right.
And so that's weird. Okay.
It's so weird.
It's not how we're used to thinking of it, right? I mean, Niels Bohr was one of the fathers of the Copenhagen interpretation, which is where this idea of the observer and the collapse of the probability wave. So everything exists as a probability wave, and until it collapses to one single probability,
right?
And that becomes the reality.
Yes.
And so he said, if you are not shocked by the quantum theory, then you have not understood it, right? Because why would that happen? And it turns out, the way we make video games is exactly that.
That's right? What I mean.
If you go back to the 80s and the Apple IIs, when I started playing, computer-based video games, when then we had Tetris on the PCs and stuff, there was no way you could render all these pixels of a world like World of Warcraft. It just couldn't be done. Right? One, we didn't have enough computing power, but two, we also didn't have the algorithms to make all this work.
To run it, to keep it run.
But one of the key things that came about was the ability to optimize, so that with 3D models, you only render that which is observed by your character.
Right.
Inside the game. So like if I'm sitting there playing the game and my avatar is here, I only see what's around him. I don't have to see what's behind the boxes. I don't have to see what's in the
because it's not necessary.
It's not necessary.
Right at this moment,
yeah,
right?
It might be later. Now, if there's multiple players, then you have to be sure to have enough for everybody.
Right.
So there's something called caching in computer science. We cache the information so that the next room is available. But maybe 5 rooms beyond it is not available until it's needed.
Okay.
So in computer science, everything is about physicists love big numbers.
They love
infinity, or they try to do calculations and say, we can't have World of Warcraft because there's too many pixels, right? That's what they would probably say. Physicists who aren't fans of simulation hypothesis would literally say, you cannot render World of Warcraft or a game called No Man's Sky because, No Man's Sky has something like 18 quintillion worlds.
It blew me away when someone hit me with that fact.
Yeah.
And that each one of those, and this brings up a good point, is our computing power has come so far that we can now do that.
We can do that, but we don't have to render it all.
Exactly.
And that's the optimization. So computer science has always been about ways to optimize, like using different algorithms and figuring out what's necessary. There's something called lazy evaluation. And what that means is, if you're doing an operation, let's say you say X equals some complicated equation. Okay. And then you never use X again in the program. It says, well, we don't need to do all that evaluation yet. But if down the line you need to say X plus Y, well, you need to know what the value of X is, right? So you evaluate X as necessary, and that saves computing power. And that's how, computer software in general turns out, yes, you can get better hardware, but the real way to improve performance is you optimize the algorithm so it only does what needs to be done, and it doesn't keep doing things that don't need to be done.
Right.
And so for me, that was a big link between quantum mechanics and this idea of simulation theory, because quantum mechanics and the observer effect, or what's called quantum indeterminacy, makes absolutely no sense if this is just a physical universe with one timeline going from the past to the future. Everything is solid. Why would you do that? There's absolutely no reason to do that.
You're spot on. Spot on. And that's exactly, there's no reason. And so what do you think that the strongest pieces of scientific or philosophical evidence is that suggests that we may actually, in fact, be in a simulation?
So I think, that was one, which is I call the observer effect being an optimization technique. Another aspect of science is this idea that the world is actually built off of information. So there was a scientist named John Wheeler,
yes,
physicist at Princeton. His office was right across from Einstein. And he's one of my favorite physicists of the 20th century. And because he's done so many interesting things and he had many interesting thought experiments. But towards the end of his life, he came up with this phrase, and the phrase was "it from bit." It
from bit, yes.
From bit, right? And so what he was trying to say was that anything that's an it, like this microphone, is a physical thing. This bottle of water is
a physical.
But if you look into that bottle of water, first of all, the bottle, most of it is empty space, right?
Right.
Atoms are 99% empty space. Between molecules and atoms is mostly empty space. And if you go inside the atom, well, electrons is really an electron cloud, but it's mostly just empty space. And then you go to the nucleus. And he said that when you look for this thing called a particle, right, our idea of solidity is built on this idea of solid particles.
Right.
Right. There is something solid at the bottom of all this.
Right.
And he said, when you keep going down, the only thing that distinguishes one particle from another is the answer to a series of yes/no questions. And what is a yes/no question? It's
a 1 and a 0.
It's a bit, right? So he said anything that's actually a physical object, and it is actually built off of information, bit.
Okay.
Bit from bit. Now, that was a controversial idea back when he came
right.
But over time, information theory, like there's an old saying and a quote in Silicon Valley from a guy named Mark Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist, but he was a co-founder of Netscape. So back in the day,
seen him on Rogan a couple times. I think.
He's been on Rogan a couple times. So he said software is eating the world. This is back in the 2000s.
Okay.
And I like to say information science is eating all the other sciences, because physics. There's a whole branch of physics called digital physics. And just like we would look at the conservation of momentum and the conservation of energy, now there are ways of looking at physics that are all about conservation of information. And they say how much information is stored on the surface of a black hole, for example. All of these types, can information ever be destroyed? And if it is, what does that mean? So they're starting to look at an information-based reality. And just last year, I was in the UK. I usually spend my summers here in Boston, but last year I went to the UK to the other Cambridge, the original Cambridge.
The original.
Yeah, as they kept reminding me, this is the original Cambridge. Like they would say Cambridge, and for a second I would think, oh, they mean it
Right, it's
by the Charles River, and it's like,
Yeah.
oh, no, we're
No.
by the River Cam, and it's Cambridge. That was the original one. But I met a Nobel Prize winning physicist there, and he said that part of, I was talking about the simulation hypothesis, and I said, well, there's at least three different assertions that we're making here. One is the world is information. The second is the information gets rendered for us. And the third is that this is all some kind of hoax.
Right.
And he said, well, the first one is not controversial anymore. Like most physicists would say, yeah, the world probably consists of information.
Correct.
I think what we don't know is how does that information get rendered in a way that is perceived as real by us.
Right.
But so I think this idea that the world is information and that maybe we're going through computational processes. So the way that No Man's Sky has 18 quintillion worlds is they're procedurally generated. So they're generated using algorithms. So all of the different flora and fauna, the leaves, they're generated using, let's say, fractal algorithms or whatever types of algorithms they're using. Today we can do that with very, small lines of code.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a guy just recently on Twitter, for example, and people can follow me at Riz Stanford on X, where he was shared it was like a few lines of code, but it was an image of what was water that was undulating with mountains, and that's all it took mathematically to generate. And there is evidence that a lot of what we think is physical, there are these algorithms that they're processing information.
I want to bring something up. There's largely been, I know we talk, it's kind of sensitive, I suppose, but I've had many experiences with DMT, and Gallimore wants to, is doing this study where they're putting people into the DMT realm long term, and trying to map that world out. The DMT world that you get brought to or whatever, or when you do intake DMT, there's another person, I forget the name, but they're doing the lasers.
Yeah, Daniel Goller.
Thank you. And they're seeing like what looks like mathematical equations in the lasers. Now, of course, it could be a trick of the eye. Like lasers do look weird, and then you're on a hallucinogenic drug. But DMT's often been described as almost like a key to the universe. Like, in I know you haven't probably done it, but I have. It brings you from one world to another. It's unreal. It feels more real there than when you come back here.
Which is interesting because that's exactly what near-death experiencers tell us, right? That it felt more real where they were than here. Now, I haven't done DMT myself, but I've talked to a lot of people that have. And, many of them have told me, actually, when I started writing about simulation theory, even back in 2019, first time somebody told me this was a guy named Sean Stone, who was Oliver Stone's son. And we were in Los Angeles having lunch with a group, and he said, "Oh yeah, I know it's a simulation." I said, "Oh, well, how do you know for sure? Like, even I wrote a book about it. I'm not even sure,
Right?
100%." He goes, "Well, because I saw all these grid lines when I was on DMT, and those grid lines are like the basics of this physical reality." And then I started to hear that again and again from many different people over time, that they see sort of a
code
framework.
Yeah.
And then Danny Goller said they take a diffraction laser, and on DMT people are seeing what looks like little characters. They describe them as katakana type characters, but
Exactly.
there may be a level of interpretation in that because that's what in the Matrix the characters were katakana. But he said, well, they weren't really katakana, they were just these small characters moving so fast, and you'd see them in the walls, which is interesting.
Yeah.
You would literally see it in the walls, and it was moving too fast to actually read it or figure out what the exact symbols were. But he had enough people that he tried this with under DMT that enough of them saw the same things that at least we can conclude there's something there. Now, is it exactly what they described? Because once again, they're describing it to us, in language that we'd have to understand.
Right. Again, going back to this idea that we actually may not have the framework to explain what we're seeing because I can't tell you. I'm colorblind. I was seeing color for one of the first times on DMT. Color that I'd never seen ever. And I was like, I was surrounded by the universe, but I was walking along this hallway, and at the end of this hall that was surrounded by the universe, or like a glossier version of the universe, but all these beautiful purples and blues, and like the stars around us. It looked like I was wrapped in that and walking through this hallway, and then there's this being, and when the being sees me, no words are spoken, but I know that it's thinking, why are you here? You're not supposed to be here yet. And it's this very uncomfortable feeling. And then boom, snap back into my body. And I was just like, what the fuck just happened?
Right. Yeah, and I've heard those types of experiences from people. But
so, like, did I log out of the video game?
I think you logged into some version of it, or you logged out of this particular version.
It's a good.
For example, in the Matrix, they have this loading area. Do you remember? There was like this white area where they had all the guns come in, like really fast. There's a great clip. If you could include it, it's worth including. Where they say we need some guns, and then you see these racks and racks of guns. That area was sort of the loading area, if you will, or the lobby in modern video games. And then they were able to take some of that with them into the actual Matrix.
Right.
What we would call, the representation of the physical world.
Right.
But at the same time, we'll come back to the beings in a minute, but in video games, I remember when we had 8-bit video games, I mentioned this earlier, and then every now and then there would be a 16-bit computer.
Right.
And they would say, oh my God, I can have millions of colors now. And because in an 8-bit computer, you can only have, up to so many, you have what's called a palette of RGB values.
Yep.
You only have 256 of them. And within the RGB, you have values, from 256. Of information with 8 bits. But the idea was that if you were in an 8-bit game, you wouldn't necessarily be able to see all these colors, right? But people who've had near-death experiences also come back and say there were colors and sounds that we have never seen on Earth. I can't even describe these hues. So that's interesting to me that you're saying they're very similar.
And Riz, I kid you not, I am one of the most skeptical of the people in the UFO, quote unquote UFO community. I'm one of the more skeptical. I'll hear anyone out, whether I think it's bullshit. That's not for me to decide. I'm a facilitator of stories and information like this, like we're talking about. So I don't make that decision I might make it in real time, but I don't say it. Do I think Dr. Greer is full of bullshit? Yeah, of course I do. But I also think there's some information in there, and you have to hear everyone out. And it kind of brings me back to this religious thing, because I feel like a lot of scientists, they threw the baby out with the bathwater. And in reality, we should probably step back and look at all religion and take it not at face value, but hear it all out. Look for similarities. I'm thinking we can all think, or we can all say there was probably a flood, right? Because all these civilizations talk about it all around the world.
There's some new papers out that suggest there might have been scientific papers.
Exactly. So, it just starts begging the question. Did our ancestors, or did ancient civilizations, we have a lot of distraction around us. Were they keen to, did some sort of ability of ours atrophy over time, that now we can't see what they were seeing then and what they were trying to describe to us in the literature, and what makes scientists these days throw everything out because it all sounds like it's magic and fairies.
Right. And I think that, for me, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and why I dedicated so much time to the different spiritual traditions. It's because we should take it seriously, but not literally. And what happens is scientists try to take it literally, and then they dismiss it because obviously, literally there isn't a little angel on your shoulder, right? That we could test or find out about. And that's part of my problem with modern science is it started to ignore these experiences which people have, but which may or may not be reproducible on demand. And it's almost as if you have 1,000 people that went to China, and the scientists are saying there's no such place as China. So, well, here's 1,000 people that went to China. We can at least conclude there is some place kind of like that called China. Now, they may have different accounts. Some of them may have gone to the south where it's warm, and there's beaches, and some may have gone to the mountains where it's cold, and some may have gone to the desert in China. But there are enough similarities in these travel accounts, if you will,
Right.
that we can make some assertions. And that's why I think the simulation hypothesis is a way to bridge the gap. Because it is a technoscientific idea, it's a technoscientific metaphor.
Right.
So is the book. A book is a technoscientific metaphor. Clothes are technology metaphors. The wheel of samsara is a metaphor. It doesn't mean there's literally a wheel there. It's a technological metaphor so that people can understand.
Wow.
This idea that things go round and round. But so that I can talk to scientists at MIT or Harvard or Stanford about the simulation hypothesis. Now, they may not agree with all of it, but at least we can talk about it. We can have a conversation about it.
And that's where the most, and I feel like we're losing that right now, is if we don't agree, then I'm your enemy. Like, that's how the world is being framed right now. And it really upsets me because we're not supposed to agree on everything. We're supposed to have these, and it does bring this idea into my, if it is simulated, we have the best writers right now. The writers' room, they are owed an award because the if you look at the world right now, I mean it's a huge joke, right? It's a cosmic joke. You got a reality TV star as president. It blows me away. It blows me away.
Make it interesting, right?
Yeah, no, they've definitely, we're all living on this strand of mutually assured destruction, right? The world is held hostage by that idea. It really bothers me, and that's why
this is a way to bridge the gap, between religion and science, but also between religions themselves.
Yes.
To say, okay, they were talking about similar things, because in the end, if you can strip away the cultural aspects of a religion, and I think people don't do that when they try to take the religious scripture literally.
Yes.
I mean, they were written for a group of people at a certain time with certain challenges in their society.
Yes.
We don't necessarily have those same challenges. We have a different set of challenges.
Exactly.
So if you strip away the cultural elements of the religion and say what religion is really about, if you talk to religious scholars, and I've met a lot of them because, even though my background's in technology and science, I actually have presented at academic religious conferences about this idea. They'll tell you basically, if you talk to people, that religion is about what happens after we die, what happened before we're born, what's the purpose.
I have a story about that.
Right. So these are the big questions, right?
Right.
But if we focus on the cosmology of the religions, and sure, there are differences. I mean, some say there's reincarnation, and some say
right.
Some say this person is the most important.
The Messiah.
Yeah. Is most important. But if you strip away some of that and say, okay, what is it they're telling us about how the world works? That's where it becomes interesting. And
that's where the information is.
Simulation theory. I mean, I've had people, email me from different parts of the world, Buddhists, Hindus, Jewish folks from Israel, Arabs email, Turkish Muslims email me and say, oh, this simulation thing actually makes sense. Because the young people today, they look at these old scriptures and they're like, yeah, what's all this BS, right? And they see the fundamentalists, the older people who are fundamentalists in their religion.
Yeah.
Right. But this becomes a way for them to understand this entire idea.
And I think that's a great way to say it. It is a bridge, but not only between religion and science, but interreligion, because that's a good way to frame it.
I mean, I wrote another book. Obviously, right now we're talking mostly about simulation hypothesis, but I wrote a book a few years ago called Wisdom of a Yogi, And
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
it was about a guy named Yogananda, Swami Yogananda.
Yes.
Who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which is probably one of the best known books in the West
Yes.
about yoga and meditation.
Yep.
And so Yogananda came over from India in the 1920s, and he was one of the first swamis to actually come and live in the U.S. I mean, others visited, but he lived here and established, a set of teachings. But it was really that book that made a difference in the 60s to the countercultural movement, the hippies. Like most of them would pass around this book. It was one of the most passed around books of the generation. In fact, I met somebody a couple years ago. He said, "Oh yeah, I was in Ashbury in the 60s. And somebody gave me a copy of this orange book, and it was Autobiography of a Yogi, and I read it, and then I passed it on to somebody else." And, Steve Jobs' favorite book. And so I was asked to write a book about him and about his lessons on the 75th anniversary of Autobiography of a Yogi, and from HarperCollins, India. So from India, they're like asking me to write a book about, the lessons in his yoga.
Interesting.
Book. And I said, "Are you sure you want me to write?" I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a technologist. Yes,
Right.
I like Yogananda a lot. I quote him. In fact, even in the simulation hypothesis, in the chapters on, religious dream, the world being a dream, I quote him.
Ooh.
But I'm not a swami. Don't you want somebody more steeped in the knowledge? They said no, because we want somebody who can bring modern ideas and language and technology and social media and all of these ideas to younger people to understand these ancient yogic spiritual ideas. And turns out Yogananda was also updating the technology metaphors of his time. So he came over in the 1920s, and he had to explain
Very
ideas
different.
like Maya or illusion,
Right.
karma, to people in the West. And this is, primarily a Christian country at the time.
Right. So these are very, very unique or new ideas.
Yeah. And so he had to come up with ways to explain it. And the way that he came up with was, he said, well, the world is like a movie. It's like a film projector. And yes, the characters suffer immensely, because he himself had seen some newsreels of World War I, which was the first mechanized war.
Yes.
I mean, the killing was on a scale that...
The Russians lost, I think. Oh my God. Yeah.
I mean, World War I was called the Great War because of the machine. They had
Right.
machine guns. But he was looking at reels and said, how could God allow such suffering? The answer was, yes, they're suffering, but if in a film, the actors don't die, the characters suffer while they're in the movie. And so he would use this analogy, and he would say, look away from the screen, because all of this is the screen. You look towards the light that's projecting right onto the screen, and that's who we really are. Now,
that's consciousness?
Well, that was consciousness or God, right?
Right.
God was projecting the light. That was his way of describing it. That the whole world is like shadows, and he was trying to describe the idea of Maya or illusion to people. And
I thought Maya is Earth.
No, Gaia is Earth.
Oh my God. Oh my God, I'm such an idiot.
So Maya means illusion.
Okay.
And in the Buddhist traditions, Buddha literally means woke up, somebody who's awake. Because somebody asked him, "What are you?" He says, "Well, I'm awake." He said, "I am Bud," and that translated to the Buddha. Which we call the Buddha today. But that means everybody else is asleep. So the dream is another metaphor to say that the world around us isn't really the real world. And so Yogananda was trying to come up with a metaphor to explain that in a way that would make sense to modern audiences.
So he used
the movie projector.
So metaphor. Good.
But if he was around today, so my assertion is that he would say we're in a film, but we're the actors, but we're also the audience. We have a script, but we can change. We have free will to change the script. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing video game where we're all the players, but we're all characters in the game. We're all watching the game from our own perspective.
Right.
Yet there's parts of us that are outside the game as
well. Wow. When we come, we could take a break right here. You take a bathroom break or something. And then when we come back, I want to start getting into some of the UFO and how UFO stuff and how how I see the bridge between the two and how it can allow for that. So we'll be right back. All right, that's going to do it for this episode of Total Disclosure. But don't worry, this is a 2-part conversation with Rizwan Virk. So part 2 will be available very, very shortly. If you're a member on YouTube or Patreon, it's already available. And if you want to become a member, help support the show, please feel free to check out the links in the description below. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. And if you're listening on one of our amazing podcast platforms, feel free to leave us a favorable review and follow the show. It really helps. It's free, takes 20 seconds, and like I said, helps with that pesky algorithm. All right, guys, we'll catch you on the flip side.